So I can imagine you probably have some real-time monitoring on some of these assets as well too. So does that kind of drive, all right, I've seen something that's becoming a trend. Now I need to go do this at a different interval than what I do normally for identifying those single points of failure.
Well, sure. I mean, your monitoring is really your key. What is happening? Am I starting to see a load increase or decrease? And the only way to know that is through trending data and looking at your monitoring and having good reporting structures to be able to look at that. One of the challenges is why, if I'm increasing load, why am I increasing load? Or if I'm decreasing load, why am I decreasing load? Or things like of that nature. Then it starts to run you down certain rabbit holes, if you will. But you want to make sure you don't get too far down a rabbit hole because you could be going down the wrong path.
We've been there before.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so Dan, I can imagine that it's imperative to know those single points of failure. So how often should you conduct the risk assessments?
Well, first of all, if you're a new director going into an older hospital, the first thing that I would tell administration was you need to let me do an inspection of the hospital because I don't want to be blamed for something that wasn't my fault. So, and we do this a lot because, as you know, healthcare groups are acquiring hospitals and they're dumping hospitals daily. You never know who's going to be in charge. And as a director, I can only relate that to a ship's captain. They give him a boat, but it's 20 years old, and they expect him to run that boat. Well, what if something happens to that boat? Are they going to blame him, or are they going to go back 20 years and blame the commissioning agent for not finding something? A single point of failure, a lot of people think, well, it's the transfer switch gone bad, it's the generator gone bad. Well, no, it's not. It's something inside those components that went bad. And that's what you got to look for. And I'll give you a couple of examples. I mentioned this in the paper that I'm going to post on ASHI, hopefully today. But we had one level 1 trauma center that was responsible for 14 counties and a state, and I won't mention the state. But they had been in business for 12 years, and they'd never had a power failure that lasted for more than probably 45 minutes. And the only other time the generators ran under load was when they did their 30-minute test. Well, 12 years later, they have a power failure, a big power failure that lasted over 3 hours. Well, the generators ran fine for 2 hours before they didn't. And those day tanks, to tell you the bottom line here, the day tanks were all sized for 2 hours worth of fuel at existing load. Well, when your pumps are powered from a non-essential panel, bad things are going to happen. When they lost utility power, the day tanks emptied and the generators quit. And here we have a 700-bed hospital that's in the dark. They were found liable because 2 patients were compromised. But that single point of failure happened to be the contractor's inexperience in landing cables where they should have been landed. But a good commissioning agent, had he been a person that had had a lot of field experience, had commissioned that job, he would have found it in the beginning, but they didn't. They overlooked it. As a matter of fact, the hospital did not want to pay for the extra commissioning assignment, and they paid for it 12 years later. Something like that hopefully will never happen to anybody that y'all know, but it could. Somebody asked me the other day, well, what about a single stage filter on a generator? That's a single point of failure if you think about it. If your generators don't have at least a dual or a triple stage fuel filtration system, you may have an issue, especially during long runs. And Rod, I know you're familiar with long runs. I think we wrote a paper a couple of years ago where you were down for about 98 hours.
Oh, yes.
And if that fuel wasn't clean, which I don't want to stretch this out, but you've got a fuel policy system that keep your fuel clean. But bad things can happen. Last year, September the 27th, we were in North Carolina when that hurricane came through and we took a direct hit. No damage to the house. We lost 7 trees, and I've got a 40 kW generator sitting outside. And I'm wondering to myself, did I fill that tank up appropriately before that storm hit? Because nobody up there expected this. Generator ran for 288 hours. And then I changed oil. And I'm kind of segueing a little bit here, but not having spare parts on the shelf to take care of something like this is a single point of failure, if you think about it. Fortunately, I had oil, I had filters, I had a belt, a battery on charge, so I was ready for it in a way. But I kept thinking, how full is that propane tank? It could have been a single point of failure. Fortunately, it lasted.
Yeah.
But you got to think courtroom. Anytime that you take over a hospital, or anytime that you take a new one and put it in, I'm trying to say here, getting mumble mouth. It's been a long night. But once you take over a new hospital, you need to put that sucker under a load. And I'm not talking about a 30-minute load. You need to run it for 4 hours. You need to simulate a power outage. In a courtroom, bad things can happen if you don't do, let's just say, go beyond the code. I've seen attorneys make a very good director look terrible because he asked a question. He said, what code are you using? Well, 2010 NFPA 110. Oh, okay. Have there been newer editions? Well, yes. The 2024, whatever it was, has been published. Why didn't you use that? Well, we didn't have to. The attorney looked over, and he's got 12 people sitting there in the jury that didn't know how to get out of jury duty. So you can imagine how much they knew about what was being explained to them. But that's what they heard. They did not use the latest code. And to me, whenever I talk to folks, I say, you better use the latest code, because a litigator will, if he's got you in a courtroom.
Well, Dan, you bring up a good point there, is that, the codes are minimums. And depending
Yes.
on where you're at in the country, in the world, you have to look at the environment around you. I'm in South Florida. We have hurricanes. Every year, I run my generators for at least 4 hours in February to make sure that they're going to stay operating when I get into hurricane season. So if there's anything I need to do where we find an issue, we start then, and we know what we have. But, and it's only required that even the new codes, you don't have to run it for 3 hours every 3 years, I believe is the code. And that, it doesn't make sense for me. I'd rather do it every year and know what I have before I get into a month need situation. So.
Well, it makes sense. Interestingly, after that one incident at the hospital that I mentioned, the technical committee for 110 got together and said, maybe we should put something in the code or in the standard, just because it's not a code necessarily, but to address that. So that's where section 8.4.9 came in. Every 3 years, you need to run it at least under 4 hours with all equipment attached, all transfer switches. Basically, you're pulling the plug, for 4 hours to see what happens. I think that's one of the best things we did in NFPA 110 was to place that in there.